Special Ordinance Committee meeting to order. Maybe have a roll call.
Certainly. Member Rouse? Here. Chair Snedden?
Here.
Member Gutierrez?
Here.
Thank you. Do we have any public speaker requests for items not on the agenda today?
We do not.
Okay, thank you. With that, I would like to invite staff report on proposed residential tenant protection ordinances.
Thank you very much. Chair Snedden, members of the Ordinance Committee. What we'd like to do is begin with some background information. This project started in December of 2016, so we have a couple of years of information to summarize before we get into what's before you today. I would like to acknowledge that we've received correspondence from both the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors as well as the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association, which you should have at your places. And those letters raised some good questions about the proposed ordinances. So I'm going to try and make this work from here. Sue Gray has been my partner in developing all of this. There are some areas I'll mention in advance where we varied slightly from what the council had directed, and we'll explain why when we get to those points. Sue, would you go ahead? This thing doesn't really want to work. Thank you. Okay, so I mentioned December of 2016. This was actually an interesting session. It was what was called a Council Workload Priorities meeting, and it was an effort to try and square up what was going on in the organization with the Council's priorities. During that meeting, the Council actually added an assignment, which was to take a look at the possibility of some residential tenant protection measures. The context in the fall of 2016, if I am remembering correctly, was that there had been a series of articles in some of the local papers talking about rising rental prices and the tight market, so there was quite a bit of concern. Next slide. So that led to a report that we came back to and next slide, please, that we came back to the council with in March of 2017. And these slides are partially lifted from that report, partially new material. So the job was to see what the facts were. We were genuinely trying to understand what was going on, and then work with housing staff and the public to try and get a handle on what possible solutions might be. Next slide. So there was some initial engagement before we came back to the council in March of 2017 with the Apartment Association. I believe there's a new name shown as a CC other than Tommy Thompson. We'll probably find that out when we have public comment. CAUSE, the Association of Realtors, Rental Property Association. And then CAUSE introduced us to a group called Tenants Together out of the Bay Area, San Francisco, if I remember right. And I don't think we've heard anything from them of late. Next slide, please. So we inventoried the existing city regulations, and this is important to understand what we already have on the books. First and foremost, the city's rental housing mediation program has been busy and successful for a long time. It goes back, interestingly, to the same time frame as the lease ordinance and mediation program that was developed up in Northern California and Palo Alto. So it's interesting because these cities were dealing with the same problem at the same time, in this case in the 70s and 80s. So that's one program. Part of the recommendation that's not discussed today, because it was a direction to staff, was to develop some enhanced mediation tools and programs. All that you have in front of you today are the pieces of the recommendations that require you to enact new laws in the form of ordinances. The other ordinance we have, I've never seen before, and it's largely ignored. It requires property owners, landlords, to send notices to the city clerk when they direct a notice to quit to a tenant. And so it's a means of monitoring the amount of turnover going on. It's never been complied with. There are one or two law firms that occasionally send notices to the clerk's office. Now, the limited tenant displacement assistance that's already on the books is restricted to where there's a demolition or change of use of the property. So if a large apartment complex were completely demolished, or if it were going to be converted, say, into a shopping center, you do have law on the books that would require some displacement assistance. And finally, because of the recommendations in 2017, we looked at what the fire department was doing, and every couple of years they are getting out and inspecting the apartments, for lack of a better or more precise description. Next slide. Okay, so March 2017, these were the options. The council struck rent control right off the list. I had included it for the sake of being comprehensive, not out of any interest in the subject particularly. And what the council agreed to go forward on was really not on this list. So we'll get to that in a minute. Next slide. So in reviewing those 5 options, I came to the conclusion that there were no real fatal flaws in any of those options, whether it was enhanced mediation down through to rent control. And I also found that the housing element the city adopted in 2015 really sets a strong legislative fact background for what you're doing. So when you look at these kinds of laws, you not only want to understand what's going on in the market right now, but you also want to look at what the city's policy is. And the existing city policy around housing is generally expressed in this part of the general plan called the housing element. So we looked at that pretty closely. Next slide, please. So table H15 in the housing element is important. It talks about vacancy rates from 2000 to 2012. And when it was published, this table showed an 8.6% vacancy rate. When these reports were being prepared in 2016 and 2017, the vacancy rate was extraordinarily low. I don't know that that number is still current, but I would venture a guess that the vacancy rate is less than 8.6% right now in terms of residential tenancies anyway. Next slide, please. Okay. We wanted to know about rents. So this was the data through mid-2016. And Ms. Gray, I don't recall, were these department data or did this come from the Dyer-Sheehan report? Do you remember?
I do not recall. They look like they're numbers from the city's annual rent survey.
Okay. Okay, next slide then. More factual information. A lot of housing built before 1990. That would suggest that that we have older housing stock, a lot of rehabilitation needs, expensive to maintain. That's something to take into account when you look not only at the lease ordinance, but also in terms of mass evictions. One of the areas that there is give and take is when your regulatory activity discourages some behavior you want. And so if you wanted to encourage renovation, I would assume you want to be careful that whatever law you pass doesn't discourage renovation. But anyway, that's why that statistic is important to how you think about this problem. Very low growth rate, steady household size, and really low growth through to 2040. Next slide, please. Santa Barbara has, I don't know that I would call it unusual, but we have a large percentage of rental housing. And that means that the actions you take with respect to housing regulations in the rental market are going to affect a very large part of the community. This is not a small issue. This is a big community-wide kind of issue. Next slide, please. Again, these were, keep clicking, would you, all the way, one more? Okay, so this was to compare what the housing element said by way of affordable costs to extremely low through above moderate versus what's going on in the market. And the way I read it, the current rents are significantly higher than what would have been considered affordable by table H20. Next slide. household income is for the majority of Santa Barbarans under $75,000 a year. And next slide. This is go ahead and click through to the RHNA stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. And to understand this, you kind of have to roll back the clock 40 years, and I'm going to do that very quickly. When the state first got interested in local planning in the early 70s, it was in response to bedroom suburban sprawl. And the state required preparation of a general plan that would guide orderly development of the community in the future. So Santa Barbara and many cities did that. The general plan, as I mentioned earlier, includes what's called a housing element that talks about how to meet the city's housing needs. Cities have been slow meeting those housing needs as far as the state is concerned. So over the years, that same state housing law has been tightened progressively to require more and more accountability for cities in providing housing and affordable housing. So this regional housing needs assessment is now a system where the state, through the council of government in the area, determines your fair share of housing for all income levels. So the state has created an obligation for the city of Santa Barbara to provide housing for people at all income levels. And that's translated into a number that, if I remember right, is somewhere in the 4,500 unit range over the 8-year time frame of the housing element. So what this is saying is that the unmet need through 2023 is about 3,800 affordable units. So you have a substantial unfilled demand or need, according to the state, for additional affordable housing. That conversation pushes through, just to put this in context for another problem or issue, pushes through into how you deal with average unit density ordinance problems. It also pushes into the state's housing accountability law that now prevents you from taking away units that have already been authorized by the general plan and zoning. So the state really doesn't want us to reduce housing, and in that context, this ordinance is meant to be supportive of the availability of all of this rental housing and affordable housing that the city identified in its housing element.
Mr. Cohen?
Yes.
On this slide, what does the percent indicate? Is the percent of units needed or of the total? I'm not sure.
That's the county-wide allocation, or South Coast allocation, if I understand it correctly.
So that would be the city of Santa Barbara would need to provide 71% of the county's allocation?
South Coast.
South Coast.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I couldn't tell you where the South Coast boundary line is, but I imagine it's somewhere up coast of Goleta. Okay, next slide. Okay, now getting to the specific topics that were discussed back in March of 17. Enhanced mediation, the discussion at the time would have made it an ordinance-driven program. It's not currently. You could require registration of rentals so that we had an inventory of who the owners were, how many units they had, and where they were. That was viewed as a soft regulatory approach to try and understand the market rather than regulate it. It's technically possible to make mediation or arbitration mandatory. Mandatory and mediation is kind of an oxymoron phrase, so I don't think anyone really wants to push that. And then there was some discussion about creating an affirmative defense to evictions if mediation wasn't pursued. That didn't go anywhere. Next slide. Okay, mandatory leases, and this was from March of 17. Quick survey. What this program does is require the tenants who are in covered housing types, we'll talk about that, to be offered a one-year lease. They don't have to take it. The lease doesn't necessarily have to say that the rent won't change during that year. It's simply a means of stabilizing, from the tenant's point of view, their housing situation so that they'd have a year to understand their situation rather than as few as 30 or 60 days. Next slide. We talked about an inspection program.
Just a moment.
Yeah, certainly.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Previous slide, please, Ms. Gray. So, where it says require landlords offer one-year leases if the tenant is the tenant is looking for something for less than 1 year. Is that, so it's an offer, but it's not necessarily a mandate that it has to be a one-year lease, just a written agreement, or is that spelled out?
The landlord's obligation is to demonstrate that they offered a one-year lease. If the tenant rejects it, the landlord's done their job and is through with the ordinance.
Does that
until next
rejection
year.
need to be documented?
Yes, and there are questions along those lines in the letters. We can take those when we get to the detailed discussion of the lease ordinance. Right now, I'm just running through the 5 options we talked about in March of 17. So if you give me a minute, we'll come back to those details. All right, multifamily inspection. There was some discussion about this as a means of assuring safety and habitability. I think the general consensus was the imposition of a fee on property owners was undesirable and difficult. There was some attention paid to a program out of Anaheim where that was a no-fee inspection program. The difficulty without fees is there's no way to fund the staff needed to actually get out there and inspect apartments for safety. Next slide. Just cause eviction. To understand this, it's easiest to understand that under current law, you don't need a reason to terminate a tenancy. Ordinances that require just cause eviction list a series of reasons why, or reasons why you can't, depending, evict someone or remove them. So the idea is that if a tenant is paying their rent and doing everything else right, just cause eviction would stop that individual from being removed without cause, without some violation of the lease, some violation of law, something. That's hotly contested. It's not in the recommendations before you today. Next slide, please.
I have a question, Mr.
Yes.
Flynn. At the council meeting, when this was directed, I believe we wanted a report back. I think it was Mayor Pro Tem Rouse who requested a report back on what the state just cause eviction.
I'm touching on that. I'm touching on what I'm aware of the state is doing. I don't believe there's a state just cause eviction law. I hope I'm not wrong on that, but I don't believe there is. There have been the context here was that there were a number of initiatives up in the Bay Area around just cause and rent control, and that was where the conversation came. I don't believe there's been state action on it.
I'm remembering back to that conversation, and I think we said at some point somebody said that it's already protected by the state, or that's already addressed by the state, and then and then we said, well, what are those protections? And then we wanted a report back. Is that
What I wanted, Madam Chair, was make sure that we weren't trying to reinvent the wheel on things that were already supersede things by the state.
I can address that, and I understand. What the city ordinance and state law forbid now is unlawful discrimination in the provision of housing. And that discrimination would apply to a number of what are called protected categories. So there are things like familial status, ethnicity, national origin, gender, sexual orientation. That's different than just cause. Those laws protect an individual from discrimination aimed at an unalterable characteristic that they have personally. Can't change whether you're male, female, black, white, whatever it is. The just cause ordinances deal with the reasons that a tenancy can be terminated. So I might decide to terminate your tenancy without a reason, And that wouldn't necessarily be discriminatory. My motive might be perfectly pure. So they're two different bodies of law, discrimination as opposed to cause for eviction.
I believe there was reference to causes for eviction such as disruption or violence, or was a list.
We have that in this ordinance. We can talk about it when we come to that point. I'll go through those. All right. Okay, next slide. Rent control. I'm bringing this up not to suggest it, not to raise a wound, but to put it in context because we do have state action coming on, potentially on the ballot, to be aware of it. So currently rent control is lawful, but it's highly limited, and basically it's limited to pre-1995 housing for the most part. So rent control is not technically a great option, although Santa Barbara does have a lot of old housing where it might be useful. The concern about rent control is always understanding the economics of the market and how the rent control will affect the market. That's very hard to predict. So I've cautioned repeatedly that when you're directly controlling prices, you better have a good understanding of what that's going to do to the market. Having said that, next slide. Prop 10 would repeal Costa-Hawkins. There's a fair amount of misinformation about it. And what that means is that before Costa-Hawkins, the California Supreme Court had determined that cities have inherent in their police powers, that power to protect the health, safety, and general welfare, cities have inherent in that power the ability to control rents. This Prop 10 adds specific legislation that authorizes cities to control rents. So what the real effect of Prop 10 is to repeal the Costa-Hawkins restrictions on rent control and put it back at the basic rule that the city can regulate prices, but it can't take the private property of the landlords. And at some point, price regulation can't be so rigid that the owner doesn't get a fair return on his or her investment in that apartment or whatever it is they're renting. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, that's the repealer on Costa-Hawkins. Finally, now the council direction. So March of 17, the council had some discussion, also decided to create a task force, and you directed two specific follow-ups after the task force report. The task force recommended a number of actions, and the way I would describe it is that the council picked two of those for further work. The first was what was called Joint Protection and Accountability Initiative. There had been some disagreement about mandatory leases, and this title really came out of that disagreement, but still included the council's direction to prepare a mandatory lease ordinance. So that's what we did. The second one is the harder of the two ordinances. That's the displacement and relocation assistance for mass evictions. Let's run through these ordinances, and we can get into the details then on each of them as we do. Okay, mandatory lease offers. So what we're proposing, and this should be the first of your two attachments. So this is attachment 1 I'm working from. And this would add a new chapter 2640 to the code. Requires 1-year leases. Let's look at the details, the who, what, whens, and all of that. Next slide, please. Okay, who's covered? Well, the definitional term is that anyone with a rental unit would be entitled to a mandatory lease offer. But rental unit excludes single-family dwellings, hotels, vacation rentals that are lawful, condos, any place the landlord's living, so you wouldn't have to offer a lease in your own home if you were renting out a room, Some institutional housing, it speaks to medical or hospital housing, and then government-owned housing, whether it's housing authority or city, would be excluded. So what's left is really the multifamily residential market that would be subject to this mandatory lease requirement. And I guess the rationale would be that it's fair for the government to expect bigger multifamily units to have a little more sophistication in management, whereas renting a single-family home or a single condo, you may be dealing with a less sophisticated owner who would have a harder time administering all of this. There's also a personal privacy component. If you're going to rent a room to someone in your home, I think it's reasonable for the government to give you more control over how your home is shared. So that's the thinking behind deciding who's covered by this ordinance. Next slide. What's required? You have to make a written offer of a written lease. Now, the ordinance specifies that the simplest way for a landlord to do this is to sign a lease and hand it to the tenant. Say, here's your offer, sign it. If the tenant signs it, that's evidence of the offer. If not, the landlord will need to document rejection of the written offer. Okay, so let's talk about how this conversation is going to go. I'm the property owner and landlord, and I don't want to offer this property except with a lease. I don't want to offer it month to month. So I offer a lease to a tenant. Tenant rejects the lease. Must I rent to them month to month? Answer, no. You're entitled to insist on a lease if that's what you want to do. This ordinance doesn't affect that situation. Now, what if the situation is landlord would prefer to rent month to month? In that instance, the landlord does have to offer a written lease. The tenant may accept it. If the tenant rejects it, the landlord is free either to reject the tenant or to offer something other than a lease. So again, lots of options. Now, probably the hardest piece administratively, next slide, please. Probably the hardest piece administratively would be the requirement that you offer a lease again if the tenant has rejected it at one point. The ordinance requires you down the road at the end of the period to offer the lease again. And I would be concerned as a property owner with having a calendar system to tickle a reminder on that kind of thing. So that there could be mistakes made inadvertently by a property owner on that requirement. Now, the last bullet here I've mentioned before, I'll mention it again. The idea behind the lease is not to guarantee a certain rent for a year. The lease could have the rent go up every month as far as the city's concerned. All we're concerned with is that rent number or numbers be negotiated and locked in at the time the lease is signed so that the tenant has some certainty about what's going to happen to them in the year.
I want to be sure I understand that because it was in the staff report and in the ordinance itself. So prices could change within the year, but you would have to know that ahead of time for the year when that would happen. So you can't renegotiate mid-lease for increased rents.
You can always negotiate. You can't mandate or evict to get there.
So if both parties wanted to renegotiate, they could, but it would not be mandatory.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And so I can imagine a situation where there's a longtime tenant, a landlord has an interest in keeping that longtime tenant because they have taken good care of the unit, they're stable, steady, easy to work with. Landlord has some vacancies coming up and wants to get the rent synchronized 8 months into the year. So maybe the lease offers a 2% rent increase for 7 months, and in month 8 it goes up to 5 or 10. There are lots of situations where I can imagine a landlord needing to do that for retaliatory or discriminatory reasons. So again, this ordinance is not meant to control prices. It's meant to create stability in the lives of the people who are renting. And frankly, it's predictability for the owners as well. Okay, next slide. Okay. How you write the remedies for these ordinances is very important. And it's interesting because it's maybe a more explicit example of the city trying to affect the private sector than we normally do. So normally the city passes a law and staff or my office goes out, or the police goes out and enforces that law. This ordinance isn't trying to do that. This ordinance is trying to allow the parties in the marketplace, the landlords and tenants, to go resolve their own problems without engaging the city. So the way the ordinance works, violations create a defense to eviction or actions to collect rent. So the tenant, if the landlord violates the requirements of this ordinance, the tenant doesn't need me to do anything. The tenant can protect him or herself in court if there's an effort to evict them or an action to collect rent. And of course, the tenant can seek injunctive relief, that is an order from the court directing the landlord to do or not do something. Now, our office can still get in there and do enforcement, but it's very important in my mind to have these private remedies built into this. I think in the staff report, we mentioned an example on the books now, and I say this recognizing that this example is trivial compared to the issues we're talking about with landlord-tenant. But the view preservation ordinance doesn't have city adjudication of the problem. It creates a right of action between those private parties that they work through. That's what we're trying to do here on the lease ordinance. Okay, happy to take questions on the lease part of this.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Colon. So we've talked about a lot of documents and a lot of legal remedies, but the documents themselves, who produces them? Do they need to be overseen or accepted by entities such as the city? And in a case of a rejection notice, if it's not signed by both parties, does it still, is that disputable? So
okay.
The documents themselves, who produces those and in what form must they take?
Okay. Well, I'm of two minds on that issue, Councilmember Rouse, and let me walk through that. And because I'm of two minds of it, I chose the route I did with the ordinance. And the two minds are these. The ordinance is very general right now. It doesn't spell out a lot of the details. What magic words need to be on the notice? How many days before does it need to be delivered? How do you evidence rejection? How do you evidence acceptance? We could write what I would characterize as a cookbook-style ordinance that had a lot of that detail. I view those details primarily as a trap for the property owners, because if they make a mistake in those notices, the argument will be that the notices were ineffective. So I wrote the ordinance very generally, following the model that we used up in Northern California, to try and create as few traps for a less sophisticated property owner as I could. And then I also thought in terms of what benefit does more detail give to the tenant. And there's not a lot. A notice of rights, I could understand that being useful. So I think you have the choice. I'd be happy to work with property owners or realtors to increase the detail here. Excuse me. But it's to be careful what you ask for in terms of how hard it makes it for a property owner to comply with more detailed rules.
Well, that's kind of my concern, because we're trying to to have some modicum of control over an agreement between two private entities. And whether or not that's a single-family home, a condominium, multifamily units, or whatever, it just seems like legally we could get in the weeds. They could certainly be in the weeds, and particularly the property owners. So I'm not so sure. I mean, I don't know what other communities do in terms of standard. I know there are standard leases, but whether or not you could require one of those, I think would be problematic as well.
Yes, if you want, if the committee wishes to create a kind of safe harbor for property owners, what I would add to the ordinance is a direction to the community development director and city attorney to make available forms for the completion of the tasks in the ordinance, and use of those forms would create a safe harbor against a claim of inadequacy. I can easily write that if that's what the committee wants. And so the buzz phrase I'm using is we would create a safe harbor for the property owner. And certainty is good for everybody, so I'm perfectly supportive of that. It will cause a bit of delay in that we'll have to work with staff to create these forms, but it shouldn't be a massive task. Thank you. Okay?
Councilmember Gutierrez?
Thank you. In regards to notifying the homeowner, notifying the tenant about the offer, can you walk us through a little more as to how the homeowner is supposed to notify them? Is it just a written notice or lease?
Sheriff Sneddon and Councilmember Gutierrez, the ordinance, all it says is that the offer has to be in writing, and it says that the offer can be a signed lease. So if I wanted to offer an apartment in my building to comply with the ordinance, I would hand you a lease that's ready to be signed. If you sign it, great. I've got evidence that you've accepted the offer. If you reject it, what I would do is I would include in the rental agreement a paragraph with a checkbox indicating whether they had rejected an offer of lease under the ordinance. It's easy to do. I can cookbook that stuff if people would like that. I just think it's honestly overkill, but I'm not in the business of managing rental property. Maybe more certainty is good for them, and that's easy to do. Okay.
Is there anywhere in the ordinance as it is now that states what language it should be in?
You mean like English, Spanish?
Or any other, like Korean?
No,
Vietnamese?
And I did include that on the mass eviction ordinance, but not here. It should be here. We should have a language appropriate requirement so that people understand what they're doing. The hard part when you start to dig into literacy is, what does that mean? Written literacy and spoken literacy are not the same thing. So it's worth doing, but it's not a guarantee of comprehension.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the next subject and the next slide. Okay, I thought it was good to start with the mass eviction regulations by talking about what we're trying to accomplish. The council relied on the task force, and not all of the task force's thinking was completely explained. So it's worth thinking through the goal before you write the law. So these regulations are intended to compensate tenants out of the landlord's pocket when the housing market is such that a no-cause displacement is really unfair and harmful. Okay? So that's the easiest way to say it. It's meant to directly compensate the tenant for the impacts of being displaced, moving expenses, differential costs in a tight market when they've done nothing to provoke it. So that right there gives you an idea of some of the terms that we'll have to grapple with this ordinance. What's no fault mean? Next slide, please. What does mass eviction mean? These are really key definitional terms. How much compensation is warranted? These are key definitional terms that you haven't worked on. So, given the sensitivity of subject matter, we left a blank in the ordinance for the definition of mass eviction. And that blank is expressed as the termination of tenancy or eviction of more than X units in Y days. I don't know how you would like to express what you mean by mass evictions. So I went at it with a number. I did mention in the staff report, I'll repeat now, any number there is going to be difficult because if we were prosecuting this stuff even in civil court, I'd have to prove by a preponderance of the evidence that more than X units had been evicted, had a no-cause eviction within a certain number of days. So some of the ordinances really end up being, and I'm using these terms, and I don't mean it pejoratively, but I am using it consciously. This ordinance can be a backdoor way into just cause eviction if you don't have a threshold for how many units. Because you take away the threshold, and what it says is that anyone who has been subjected to a no-cause eviction is entitled to displacement assistance. So you have kind of a Hobson's choice. Put an ordinance out there that's hard to enforce because defining what mass is can be gamed by a clever landlord, or putting out an ordinance that essentially requires just cause for any kind of displacement. So that's a tough choice, and I can't find a way to finesse that choice, so I figured we'd just put it out there for you. Okay, next slide. So to understand more of the mass eviction ordinance, you did have some guidance from the task force, and it was to limit this to R3 and R4 zones, and it was also to limit monetary assistance to larger or medium and larger projects, in this case structures or lots with 15 units or more. So if you are a property owner and your property is fewer than 14 units, either in the building or on the lot, you don't pay any monetary assistance under this ordinance. It's only if you have a larger property. And what the council directed was that the monetary assistance would be 4 times the median advertised rental rate, or $5,000, whichever is greater. Based on the numbers you saw earlier today, the 1,700 and 2,400 numbers, the compensation paid would almost always be 4 times the median advertised rental rate. Now, that was this task force direction. We had to make that a little more specific. Next slide, please. So we'll get that in a second. This is the problem of the mass eviction definition. And again, the task force directed R3 and R4. The new zoning ordinance refers to those as RM and RMH, so all 4 are included as areas where a property with 15 or more units would pay compensation. So when you think about it from a property owner's standpoint, if I buy a unit of 15 units or more in an R3 or R4, or an RM or RMH, I know I'm subject to the mass eviction ordinance. So it's good to have a solid threshold because a buyer can educate themselves about the rules governing their property they're buying, and having that 15-unit number gives somebody real certainty that what they're buying is covered or not. So that's positive from a market standpoint. Next slide, please. Okay, this is what I was trying to get to. The direction talked about 4 times the rental rate. but we had to find a measure of rental rate. So what we've proposed in the quote up on the slide is the median advertised rental rate for units with a comparable number of bedrooms as determined by the Department of Community Development. Ms. Gray can describe where, that's a study that the department routinely does and publishes. I don't recall the purposes. What was the purposes for which the department does that study? What were the purposes?
Chair Snedden, council members. The purpose is just to kind of know where we are. We use this for various different applications. The study is done in April of every year. We look at Craigslist, the Santa Barbara News Press, and the Santa Barbara Independent, and just basically do a tally of everything during the month that's for rent and break it down by type of unit, whether it's single family, condo, multi-unit, and the number of bedrooms.
So the gloss that staff, meaning Ms. Gray and myself, added is the comparable number of bedrooms phrase. The task force did not say to use a comparable number of bedrooms, but in trying to be fair, we think that measure is necessary. Okay, next slide, please. We did not have direction to do this particular portion of it, but put it out there for you to consider in light of total assistance. This is a special provision that provides some additional assistance to populations who might face higher moving expenses. And those populations are low-mod households. It's going to be harder to find a low or moderate rental income rental unit in Santa Barbara than it would be to find a market unit. People who are disabled, minors, and people over 60 are likely to have a harder time finding a comparable replacement unit. So you can justify legally some additional compensation for them. The amount, might as well be $20,000. That number is there strictly as a placeholder for you to decide. What's important is that it is in the lowest situation, it's a 60% increase over 5,000. And in the highest situation, it may be a much lower percentage of additional payment to those vulnerable populations. Again, I included that because it is representative of what's out there. Council did not direct us to do that.
May I ask a question there?
Yes, please.
My concern with this is not the amount, it's that in the initial rental phase, what would prevent a property owner from not wanting to rent to someone from one of these categories because later in time, if you had equal number, I don't know, plenty of applicants and you could choose any one, what is the assurance that a property owner would specifically not choose a disabled member of our community because they might then later have to pay an additional relocation fee?
That we have, Chair Snedden, members of the committee, state law has very broad anti-discrimination protections that would give any business-minded property owner pause before discriminating like that. So what I would say is that the consequences of that discrimination are orders of magnitude more expensive than what this ordinance calls for. So the incentive isn't there to do that.
I suppose my question is, how would you know if you had 20 applications and they were all equally eligible?
I think that is a problem, and it can be a problem for families. Anecdotally, that's an issue. So I don't have an answer other than increased funding for enforcement. And I think the task force generally was very supportive of the council's decision to fund the enforcement we're doing with one particular difficult property owner. And so I think the sense was, we know how to take care of the really bad people. Let's trust the general market to do the right thing, and the bad guys will get on the flip side.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Gray, can I get a sense of the number? Do you have an idea of the number of units we're talking about? If this is 15 units or more in a complex within our city, what does that inventory look like?
Chair Snedden, Council Member Rouse. Can you repeat the question? I'm not.
So we're talking about a specific class, basically, of landlord who would have multi-unit properties. Mm-hmm. And we have a certain number of those in town. And from what I understand, we're only dealing with those at this time. So if we were talking about things, for example, like in the relocation assistance for 15 units or more, how many properties like that are there? Is that something you have at your fingertips? Or is
I do not have that at my fingertips.
That's fair. And then I think that one thing, and we probably get into this a little bit later on because obviously we need to button up parts of the ordinance, but one of our directions from council, I know, was to provide a fair amount of educational materials for both landlords and tenants from the outset to try to clear some of these things and to direct people to the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force. I don't know if that's been launched. It seems I haven't seen much of that kind of material, because I didn't know.
We have launched some of the educational components. If you'd like me to go over them, I can do that.
And we'll later on. I think
Okay.
at the chair's pleasure, I think we should probably hear from the public.
Okay.
Thank you. Would you like to continue?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
The answer to Mayor Pro Tem Rouse's questions on the housing element, but I'm not going to get it right now. Okay. Now, the bottom bullet on this page is unrelated to whether you're disabled or a minor. It is simply to point out that the task force for 0 to 5 units recommended doing nothing, and for 6 to 14, a one-time non-binding conciliation meeting would be offered. We didn't have any indication how that was going to happen, so we decided the simple thing for now was just throw in at the landlord's expense. A number of the comments we received are looking for a lot more detail in what that conciliation process would look like. That's an area where it would be good to have some time with the property owners and the Rental Property Association and the realtors. I don't know quite what they're driving at there, but it would be it makes a lot of sense to have that conversation. Okay. So what is that conciliation going to look like? I'm not sure. You know, I tried to understand what does a one-time non-binding conciliation do. It certainly creates a relationship, and on the part of many property owners, it would create a human interest in seeing that person succeed or be taken care of. So there's a psychological component to forcing that kind of interaction. But in terms of benefit for the resident, the tenant, I was having a hard time understanding why tenants would avail themselves of that. So again, the choice was to keep it very simple in the ordinance, and if you want more detail, we happy to do that, but it should be a cooperative project with the regulated people. Okay, next slide. This is the last substantive slide. So back on remedies, again, in this area, private remedies are very important. I will say somewhat crassly that there's enough money in this ordinance that landlords should be concerned about litigation. So unlike the mandatory lease ordinance, this is one where the details count and the property owner should have their act wired very tight, because there's a lot of money at risk. You can imagine an unlawful mass eviction of 20 units could be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars of liability. So this one is, just to point it out, this is, I think this will be an ordinance that's more likely to see conflict than the lease ordinance. That's all we've got. I'm happy to answer questions, and Ms. Gray as well.
I have a question. There are several places in here when we talk about cause or no cause evictions. And I think this goes back to my question of the question we had back at the city council meeting. So what would be a cause for eviction?
All right. Well, let me explain a drafting technique here. Many ordinances start with the definitions, and I don't like doing that. So I wrote these ordinances so the definitions are at the back, and for people who are used to reading ordinances, that can be different. But I like to write it so that a member of the public picking it up would have half a prayer of understanding it. So, having said that, the definition of no cause eviction is at page 7 of attachment 2. And that came up with there was a question also, I've forgotten which group sent it, but it was making sure we understood the difference between a notice of termination, a notice to quit,
Yes.
and eviction. So the definition covers that. And it may be that eviction is a word you want to change, but it's any action by a landlord to recover possession of a rental unit for any reason other than the list. And the list is failure to pay rent, violating a covenant or of the tenancy, refuse the landlord reasonable access to make repairs or improvements, permitting a nuisance, illegal use of the unit, landlord needs to recover it to comply with regulations, demo, work that'll render it uninhabitable, family use. So the ordinance tries to recognize all the legitimate reasons you'd need to get somebody out of a property and protect a property owner's ability to do that. Frankly, I would hope that the city and the property owners are on the same team on that, in that difficult tenants tend to disrupt a building or neighborhood, and we don't want to force them to be stuck with them.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Thank you. Mr. Gallant, if it's simply the lease term is run out and they're otherwise tenants in good standing and the landlord does not reoffer a new lease, does that fall into that category anywhere, or is that just the deal is done?
If the term has expired, if the tenant holds over, the question would be, were you required to offer a lease under the first ordinance? Answer, no, because I intend to recover possession. Is that was the circumstance? If you intend to recover possession to do a demo or to change the use, you are covered under the zoning ordinance, tenant displacement ordinance, and you pay 4 months or $5,000 under that law. Okay, so
Yeah.
Councilmember Gutierrez?
Thank you. If we were to change the wording, could you clarify, is there a risk of the tenant losing any kind of benefit if it changes from eviction to lease termination?
yeah, it's an interesting point. Maybe the words matter in a way that I hadn't thought. You certainly wouldn't want a tenant to have to be evicted to get benefits. So maybe instead of no cause eviction, the problem is it gets, a hard phrase, no cause termination of tenancy. You could say that. The idea here is that the tenant is in some ways being removed illicitly under this ordinance. So that's why I said no cause eviction was intended to be pretty graphic, but we could soften that up with another phrase. No cause termination, no cause removal, something like that. If that's what you're driving at.
I would assume there's some residents that would rather not have evicted on their record.
Right. I see your point. Yeah.
Yeah.
We can change that.
If there are no more questions from the committee, we will now take public comment. First, Fred Sutton, followed by Krista Pleiser.
We're very supportive of these ordinances and the spirit and the negotiations that took place. In the spirit of what was done.
I apologize. Will you start over?
Oh,
I
yes.
did not turn your microphone on.
My name's Fred Sutton. I'm here on behalf of the California Apartment Association. I took over for Tommy Thompson, who sat on the task force, but I have been a part of this conversation since January of this year. We're supportive of these ordinances. This is in the spirit of what was negotiated over 6 months in 2017. It expands assistance, and it creates obligations to offer a lease. There are issues within the ordinance, and we did put those in our joint letter with the realtors in the chamber that we would request you review. And I think we'd respectfully request that those items be addressed and it be directed back to staff so it can get hammered out and something that works for everybody. Because there are unintended pitfalls, I believe, that are in the ordinance right now that we'd like resolved. But we are supportive of the intent and the spirit of what's being done here, and we greatly appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Krista Pleiser.
I'm yielding my time to Andy Alexander.
Yielding to Andy Alexander. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chair Snedden and council members. I'm Andy Alexander, president of the Santa Barbara Association of Realtors, and I'm a member of the Tenant Landlord Task Force. Being a realtor, property manager, and member of the task force, I have an in-depth knowledge of the issues that resulted in the creation of the task force. As you have already heard, the task force was comprised of tenant and landlord representatives and met for over 5 months with a paid professional facilitator. While there is some division among these two groups, the task force affirmed that our city can overcome discord and come together to compromise on solutions. Before I speak on the proposed ordinance before you, I want to reiterate that the education component was the bulk of the recommendation package. We are still waiting for the educational pieces to be solidified, and we believe that education is the first step to ensure that both the tenants and landlords know their legal rights. As so often is the case, the devil is in the details, and these two ordinances are no exception. Overall, the ordinances are a positive first step towards our good faith and shared goals of creating residential tenant and landlord protections. We want to ensure there is transparency, which is why we submitted jointly with the Chamber of the Santa Barbara region and the California Apartment Association a detailed letter of areas that need clarification and suggested edits. Given the amount of clarification and suggested edits we submitted, it might be best to direct staff to return with changes. We believe these changes to the ordinances are critically important for the protection of both the tenant and landlords, provide legal clarity and overall value of the policy. I hope I can speak for the entire task force when I say we are still a resource and are willing to help with anything additional that is needed. As the task force showed, our community is about coming together and compromising for what is best for tenants and landlords. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Alexander, while we have you here,
Yes.
may I ask you to, if it's possible, to bullet point for us what those main edits are? We have copies of the letters, but just so we have it in open session.
Yeah, so you have a copy of the letter? Would you like me just to sort of read the letter, or?
Please.
Okay. So under the mandatory offer of residential lease, that's 26.4. I don't know if we can bring it up, but rejection. In order to create transparency and keep the playing field level, there needs to be one rejection form created by the city, which once signed, both the tenant and landlord have a copy. Any agreement in which the tenant and landlord enter should only be written, not oral. For renewal of leases, if a tenant and landlord agree upon a month-to-month lease, either at the beginning of a lease or after a one-year fixed lease, a one-year lease does not need to be offered at any point in the future. The month-to-month lease has already been agreed upon by both parties. Non-renewal of leases. Conciliation meeting needs to be clearly defined. As a suggestion, it could mean a meeting through the City of Santa Barbara Rental Housing Mediation Program, or if either tenant or landlord wants a different mediator, the requester could pay for it. G, applicability. There are homes in Santa Barbara that are second homes, and the owners may not want to rent them full-time, but seasonally, more than 30 days, so they'd be a legal rental. Seasonal rentals should be added to the section. And then remedies. Language should be added in which if there is a failure of a tenant to adhere to the ordinance, then the landlord should have defense to action. This would make sure that both the tenant and the landlord have proper reprieve. And regarding the second relocation assistance, relocation assistance required, subsection A, there needs to be a clear understanding of the difference between a termination notice, eviction, and unlawful detainer. There are legal differences between each term, and as such need to be properly defined. Section B, in order to provide transparency between the tenant and landlord, the tenant should be required to provide the number of eligible tenants of the household with documentation within a certain number of days being notified they must move. The landlord would then be required to have a specified number of days for the first installment of the relocation assistance. There needs to be a provision on how to deal with situations in which a tenant fails to vacate. A solution would be to allow the landlord to deduct a daily rental damage from the second installment for each day the tenant holds over. Subsection C, this section was not discussed with the task force meetings, and therefore we need more clarification on that. Notwithstanding, subsection A should be removed since the language is ambiguous and is already clear that the $3,000 is in addition to the standard amount. The term disability is not clearly defined. Does this mean any disability or just physical disability or something else? We just needed more clarification in that section. Subsection D, conciliation meeting needs to be clearly defined. As a suggestion, it could be a meeting through the City of Santa Barbara Rental House Mediation Program, or if either the tenant or landlord wants a different mediator, the requester could pay for it. Add eligible households instead of tenant. A suggested change could be eligible households can be represented by one tenant during a conciliation meeting. Under notice of rights, there needs to be a bill of rights created by the city. Otherwise, it is up to the landlord's discretion to provide a summary of rights. There is no defined section for notice of intent to seek no-cause eviction. Instead, the notice should be provided concurrently with the termination notice to avoid confusion. And under remedies, the phrase, or anyone assisting a landlord, is extremely problematic and should be removed. Who does this apply to? This could be used to hold attorneys, process servers, court employees, sheriff department, locksmiths liable for landlord's failure to comply. The damage portion of this seems extreme in that they have a minimum liability amount of 3 times the tenant's actual damages, but there is no maximum. This provision creates liability for mere attempts to recover possession without any limitation on how minor the violation is. For example, this could apply to a landlord who mistakenly fails to include the notice of rights with a termination notice, but then rectifies the error and still be held liable. Lastly, the following 2 reasons should be added to the section since it defines a no-cause eviction as an eviction for any reason other than those enumerated. The first part is the tenant has given written notice as provided in section 1946 of the California Civil Code to his or her intention to terminate the hiring of a real property or make written offer to surrender, which is accepted in writing by a landlord but fails to deliver possession at the time specified in that notice in writing without permission of his or her landlord, and the tenant has failed to vacate at the expiration of a fixed-term lease. But overall, that sounds, that was a lot of stuff to just go through, but we are definitely in support of the whole package. We just don't like some of the wording and want to make sure that there's a little bit more protection on the landlord side in certain areas.
We appreciate your letter, and that only took an extra 10 seconds of your time. Thank you. Did you have a question for the speaker? Let's finish public comment. Okay, so Michael Schaumburg, followed by Loy Beadsmore.
Andy's a tough act. Good afternoon, council people. Andy's a tough act there. I just have some points. My name is Michael Schaumburg, and I'm representing the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association, which has over 1,000 members. We are in support of the ordinances before your consideration today. Our association participated in the Tenant Landlord Task Force in the 2017 and met over 5 times. The task force consisted of 3 tenant and 3 property owner representatives. The group discussed a long list of potential policies to protect tenants and ultimately unanimously voted in support of requiring landlords to offer a 1-year leases and providing relocation assistance for mass evictions, both before you today. We remain supportive of these recommendations, but suggest that you direct staff to make some minor amendments as reflected in our comment letter. Additionally, we suggest that you direct staff to initiate the education initiatives which were recommended by the task force. which are also outlined in our letter. We believe these can be easily implemented and will go a long way to protect tenants. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Loy Beardsmore, followed by Jeremy Basson.
I'm Loy Beardsmore. I'm a member of the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association, and I'm here also to represent some, I guess you'd call them mom and pops, people that aren't members of the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association. I would like to, I totally reiterate everything Andy said and hope you'll really look at the language in there. People always, when they hear the word eviction, it's not the same as if you've had to give someone, a 30 or 60-day notice. But tenants refer to that as I've been evicted, and that's not true. I would also ask that the educational components of this really be put out there to the public. As a member of the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association, they're very good at informing us, educating us, but there's a lot of people out there that are renting property that don't know and don't understand what their requirements would be under this ordinance. And I would ask you how you're going to outreach to those people. Tenants need to be informed too. And we've also just reached out to our tenants because we've basically have been subsidizing them according to the Santa Barbara Housing Authority, telling us our rents are very low and that, they should be applying for housing assistance if they qualify. So outreach in that, I think the Housing Authority does as much as they can, but I think the city could also maybe do some kind of outreach that way as well. So, I guess my last thing is Jerry with the Santa Barbara Housing Authority has said, don't ever discount the mom and pops in this city, that they are the ones that are keeping rents affordable. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Jeremy Basson, followed by Lauren Mindell.
Chair Sneddon and Honorable Ordinance Committee members. I'm Jeremy Basson, a local Santa Barbara resident who owns rental housing in our community. I'm also proud to serve on the Rental Housing Mediation Board. My message is one of coming together. Although outliers do exist, the majority of landlords treat tenants with respect. It is in the best interest of landlords to keep their tenants happy and sustain occupants. It's just good business. And as the city attorney said, we can trust the market to do the right thing the majority of the time, and we can catch the bad guys on the flip side. And he's done an excellent job of doing that, so thank you. I want to remind us that any actions or rhetoric that pits us against each other will do more harm than good. At the end of the day, our goal is to provide safe and comfortable housing for the residents of Santa Barbara. This can only be done through cooperation with all sides finding common ground and working together. That was the spirit of the Rental Housing Task Force. Adopting their unanimous recommendations is the only way to move forward in a productive and cohesive manner for our community. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Lauren Mindell, followed by Frank Rodriguez.
Hello, members of the council. I'm here today to share my experience with renting in this area. When I moved to Santa Barbara County, I was renting one room in a 2-bedroom apartment, and sewage started to back up into the bathtub. When I wanted to complain to my landlord, my roommates didn't want to because they were afraid of being evicted. When I talked to the other people who were renting in this 8-unit building, they didn't want to bring it up to the landlord. They had experienced similar things over a number of years because they were afraid of being evicted. Education needs to be a part of this, but we need more protections for tenants. As it currently stands, people can be evicted, and yes, being forced to leave your home is in fact an eviction. We're talking about money for some people, but for others we're talking about a roof over your heads and where your children sleep. There is no equivalence here. We need a just cause eviction ordinance to protect people who live and work in this area. As it stands right now, workers are being forced out and cannot afford to live here. They are facing longer commutes. This is bad for our entire community. Where I work, we are currently not able to fill vacant positions because the rent is too high in Santa Barbara, and people are afraid to move here because of the current housing market. This sentiment that we don't want to mess with the free hand of the market is false. The market has always been subject to the communities in which it exists and the will of the people in those communities. And this is from the beginning of time when local governments started issuing money. We need just cause eviction protections.
Thank you. Frank Rodriguez, followed by Gabriel Lucateo.
Thank you, Chair Sneddon and Ordinance Committee. My name is Frank Rodriguez with CAUSE here in Santa Barbara, and also was part of the task force. Through us, it was definitely a learning process and a way to really talk with the landlords as a group that has been working with tenants over the years. And it was definitely a difficult process, difficult conversations, and especially as someone who grew up here and with the latest stats that we were able to help bring out, showing that 24% of our Latino populations have left Santa Barbara since 2011. That's over 9,000 people, people that include my dad who's back in Mexico, includes family members that are over in Texas. It really hurts to see we losing a huge part of our vibrancy, our community, and our networks. So for that reason, I was always the loud one in the task force, and for just reason, because we were the only ones that were really pushing to make sure that we're really putting laws that are going to protect our tenants from being displaced from this community. So that's why we were emphasizing the one-year lease, but we wanted to be able to be renewed and continued. When we're talking about habitability issue, and I really appreciate the city attorney's presentation in terms of emphasizing we have an older housing stock, and when people were evicted, it was also because of the habitability issues that we're going through. They get these rent increases, and they know it's not just because they're living with rats and cockroaches, so they have to leave, right? In this case that happened in Voluntario that came in front of city council. So with all these cases, we know we're hitting a housing crisis. This task force started with a conversation that maybe the housing crisis isn't even there, and so that's when we knew that any voice that we came with as the tenants wasn't going to go anywhere because the votes weren't in our favor. However, we were there to conversate, there to continue talking, but there's no way that we can't say that we need strong tenant protections, including just cause and other laws, to make sure we don't continue to lose the Latino population and other renters in this community who are a vibrant part of our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Gabriel Locateo, followed by Nastasia Schmal.
Well, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I've been a member of this community for the last 15 years. 5 years ago, I was evicted because a landlord wanted to rent the place to a family member. Currently, I am homeless. Of course, you can't tell that because I take showers at the local gym. And surprisingly, the reason why I don't have an apartment is because it's too expensive. And guess what? I don't have a family. I don't have kids. And yet I struggle. How do you think people with families feel with these rent prices so high? People deserve a place to live, a home, not under a bridge or a parked car at Denny's. I understand capitalism, but what landlords are doing is driving people away by raising the prices. That is the definition of irony, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Nastasia Schmal, followed by Matt Lowe.
Hello, council members. Thank you for letting me speak and for the perfect pronunciation of my name. I'm here today. I first moved here not too long ago in 2010, and I've lived in several different housing situations since I've moved here. Some all right, some really quite terrible, where we were not able to get anything fixed, broken windows, rising prices. I currently live with my partner in family student housing, and we talk to our neighbors, and a lot of them say that once there are leases ending in December, and a lot of my neighbors say that once they're no longer to live there, they don't think they can stay in Santa Barbara because it's just too expensive. I have friends, with Just Cause. I had a friend who got evicted because he reported insects, right, or infestation, right? He lived out of his car for 6 months while going to school, right? I hear stories like this all of the time from my neighbors, from my coworkers. Most of the people I know pay upwards of 50% of their income towards rent. It's not sustainable. It's pushing people out. It's pushing me out. So I think that we need strong and enforced tenant protections. I think that in the long run, if we don't get those things, this community will degrade and will not be a place where people want to live, and it will decrease diversity, and that's bad for a community, right? So thank you so much for hearing me out.
Thank you. Matt Lowe, followed by Linda Honickman.
Chairman Sneddon, council members, thank you. A comment that struck me at the very beginning of this meeting was the high rate of rental properties in Santa Barbara. And I don't think that's being taken into consideration in how this quote-unquote market is being impacted and the responsibility they have to our community. I am pro-tenant rights, but I think something that I was hearing throughout this presentation was the money that is going into making those tenants' rights possible and achievable for the community. The example was given of the Anaheim situation where they are being paid, or the property owners are paying into the system to make sure that there is renters' protections and tenant rights. I believe that can be done here, and I think we need to even extend it beyond what is being suggested of the 15 unit and over properties. It can be scalable for those that are 2 units and over, and then 6 units and over, and then 12 units and over as a scalable foundation of ways to pay into protecting our communities and our tenants. And that will go to support the property owners as well, too. And this will then turn into an equitable system that allows protections on both sides. But it needs to be done in a scalable system and not just those that are 15 and over, because yes, those are the bigger complexes in our community that have the money, but there is such a high rate of rental properties in our community that can be paying into the system, and it'll incentivize property ownership and not just rental for people to make profit off of. And so we need to not profit off of exorbitant amounts of rent for our community, but actually bringing community back into our communities with property ownership and community input. And that will be done by tenants' rights and making the financial decision to make this tenant protection scalable and responsible for our whole community. Thank you.
Thank you. Linda Honickman, followed by Reverend Julia Hamilton.
My name is Linda Honickman. I'm a former landlord and current observer of housing challenges that are negatively impacting friends and family in our area. I attended 2 of the 5 tenant landlord task force meetings and was very disappointed by the tone set by the landlord representatives. I was left with the impression that the leaders representing the realtors, the California Apartment Association, and our local property owners have no real understanding of the problems they were supposed to help solve. I hope in the future, when tenant issues are reviewed and changes are considered, there will be a more practical way to get more tenant input. I would like to comment specifically on Attachment 2, which covers relocation assistance. Follows up on what the previous speaker was saying. I think that rather than, on page 3, it talks about assistance being applicable to structures or lots containing 6 or more units. I would like you to consider changing that to 2. And I think that is going beyond the mom and pop owners. I think anybody that owns 2 units that they can rent That's a business, especially with the prices we have here. I would also like to see the monetary assistance provided to eligible residents who are living in a building with 2 or more units rather than the minimum of 15. The tenants in these situations need as much help as they would if they happened to live in a larger building. I have good friends that had to move out of an affordable rental last year because of mold, and they could not find a replacement property. They are not homeless today only because they have friends, but that's not a long-term solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Reverend Julia Hamilton, followed by Stanley Zankov, who will be our last speaker.
Good afternoon, council members. I'm here on behalf of CLUE, Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice, and I'm also a member of the board of the Fund for Santa Barbara. And I'm here because as the leader of a congregation, building community is one of the things we think a lot about. And as a pastor, I see people leaving this town, it seems like on a monthly basis. Somebody in the congregation says, I can't make it anymore, we've got to go. I had a conversation with a young adult in our congregation a couple years ago that has stuck with me. I was talking with her about building community, and she was telling me how hard it was to get connected here. She'd grown up here, and she said, I've given up trying to make new friends because when I do, inevitably, they just move away. And she was just expressing such despair about being able to connect to people in this community where she grew up because she just saw this churn over and over again. We have to do something to stabilize our community. We have to do something to make it affordable for renters to be able to make plans, for families to know what school their kids are going to be in next year, to make something so simple as friendship on a lasting basis possible. And I just see the havoc it's wreaking on people's internal lives all the time when they feel like they can be stabilized with no notice. This is why Just Cause is such an important piece of this puzzle. We have to do something to be able to give people an opportunity to make plans. I'm a renter here myself. I benefit from having a strong support network, from having family members I could turn to if I got in trouble. I've been a renter in hard markets in New York City, in Boston, and here in Santa Barbara. And here in Santa Barbara, I've seen the kind of destabilization and churn that I haven't seen even in other really difficult rental markets. I know there are solutions that are out there. I appreciate the goodwill and thoughtfulness that has gone into this process, and we need stronger protections for tenants. Thank you.
Thank you. And our final speaker, Stanley Zankov.
Hi, members of the council. Thanks so much for your time. I'm here as a concerned neighbor, a renter. I live and work here in downtown Santa Barbara. I'm a staff member of the Fund for Santa Barbara and a board member of CAUSE. So the latest study that showed that since 2011, 9,000 Latinx folks were forced out of the city is really startling, and it's really putting numbers to, I think, what a lot of us already know. This is a really dire situation that we're all in. And so I'm here to join many folks who are here, folks who aren't able to take the time off work to be here, to really say that this is such an urgent thing. And I can appreciate, of course, that that staff is really overburdened with all of the housing legislation that's coming through, and that this isn't a unique situation to our city. But I just like to stress that, you know, the more time that goes on, the more that folks' lives are being affected. It's what my young professional peers talk about. It's what folks talked about when I was working for Senator Hannah Beth Jackson when I was doing casework for housing. And it's what folks talk about when we go canvassing door to door. It's really a very urgent issue. And I'm reiterating that, obviously knowing that you know this. But there are many folks who are not here right now to say that. You all were in the city council meetings where you heard firsthand from the residents of the Voluntario tenants, of the Ivy apartment tenants, which CAUSE staff has been staying in touch with, and we know that many of those folks are no longer here, right? They've simply been forced out of the city. And so this is an issue that's affecting the character of our city, who can afford to live here, who can't afford to live here, and in what conditions we live here, for those of us that can stick around. So I strongly urge you to do whatever's in your power to move ahead, whether it's staffing, support, whether it's, all the avenues that you have within your power to move this forward. And thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. It's now to the committee. Questions, comments at this point? Council Member Gutierrez?
Yes, thank you. How long would you think that it'll take to address all the concerns that were stated in this letter?
Well, I think an additional staff meeting with interested parties is worthwhile. So, and then this is not something that I'm in a position to delegate. I need to be away from work in mid-November for reasons you know. So I think we could come back in early December if that was something you wanted us to do. Obviously, we have a lot of priorities, but this has been around a couple of years, and the community deserves our best effort to get this done promptly.
Thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I'd like Mr. Gutierrez, I think I'd like to encourage staff, or maybe I'll make a motion at the end of this to direct staff to do precisely that, and maybe we'll come back and visit this at ordinance before we forward it to for council. I'm a little. It sounds like I was listening to two results from two different task forces, and I'm a little surprised by that, given what I've heard from before this. But it seems that from the rental association folks and whatnot, that there were acceptable pieces of progress going forward that were all voted on by the entire task force, and that they have some nuances they'd like us to explore. I've got a feeling from the other side that basically there was another side, and that we're still talking about market forces and things that we really aren't actually trying to address here today. And so while that conversation can continue, I think if we're going to move forward with anything substantial, with anything we worked on, and I think very much a Santa Barbara way by having an independent task force outside of council, which I'm very proud that we did that. I think we need to move forward on those issues. Certainly the conversation with my friend Frank out there and all will continue as we go on. But I think it's important that we do that. So I would like to move that we do, in fact, direct staff to look at incorporating and or answering the questions as laid out in the SBOAR document that respond directly to issues the task force had. That would be a motion.
I think we may be looking at some more discussion before we complete the motion.
I thought that's what you were doing, Oscar. So,
I'm just concerned that we need to take action as soon as possible. So I have another follow-up question, if possible.
Councilmember Gutierrez?
You had mentioned that the term mass has not been defined yet?
That is correct. And what we proposed was X units and Y days. You could do it as a percentage. It might be more rational. So you could say X percentage of within a certain period of time constituted a mass eviction.
Okay.
May I ask a follow-up question to that? What is the rationale for why a certain number is the trigger for those types of protections as opposed to 2 units? Why the trigger of 15?
Well, I would call the 15 the threshold, and that was really just a community choice that we only wanted this to apply to larger apartment buildings. but in terms of the definition of mass, I think the idea is that there will be some routine, no-cause termination of tenancy, and that's okay. It's only when it is really a sham for emptying out the building to do something else that we're concerned. So I think the idea behind mass is that the sheer number of changes in tenancy implies some kind of improper intention. Now, the impact, of course, on the individual tenant is no different when it's you or you and your 15 friends. So from that perspective, I can understand different thresholds. But again, I read the mass eviction concern to mean that to be focused on the sort of improper intent of the owner rather than the impact on the resident.
And what would a percentage look like then? If a property had 4 units, could it still be a mass eviction if you're evicting 3 of those units or 4 of those units or 100%? Or to what scale would the percentage go down to?
Chair Sneddon, did you say 40? 40?
4.
4. Okay. Well, as we're set up now, the 4 units is too small to be covered at all. So in a 15-unit apartment, if you expressed it as percentage, I know that in the context of affordable inclusionary, the studies have shown 10 to 15% can be accommodated. Does that say anything about the number of people being evicted? I don't know. So my instinct is that it's maybe more than 10%, and percentage should be more generous to the larger apartments. So let's imagine you had a 100-unit apartment and the threshold was 15%. You're talking about 15 units. Whereas if we set X units over Y days, that X figure, the number of units, has to work for all size apartments. So intuitively, a percentage sounds better because it will be proportional and equivalent in proportion across the board to all apartment owners. Whereas if you use a fixed numbers, it will disproportionately impact smaller owners. Right?
Councilmember Gutierrez?
So may I make a motion?
Of course. We may still have discussion, but anytime.
Sure. Make a motion to define mass as 10% of the units over 30 days.
I don't see a second on that motion at this time. Let's keep discussing. I have a few questions also. Mr. Klon, that one of the issues that seems to come up repeatedly is habitability. That we heard about sewage, broken windows, infestation, mold. Voluntario is always brought up. What in these, is there any addressing of those issues? And I realize that might be outside the scope of what we're addressing today. I just want to check in if that is in consideration in a second phase of this, or is this our opportunity to discuss that?
And Chair Sneddon, that is the effect of poor habitability on evictions. The mass eviction ordinance allows a landlord to recover possession when the tenant has refused reasonable access for repairs or improvements. So the landlord would remain able to have someone leave if their unit was so bad that it was uninhabitable.
So it may be a valid concern that if sewage was backing up, that a tenant may not want to report that for risk of being evicted for repair?
No, I think it would be for fear of being evicted arbitrarily. Now, it gets very complicated because sewage backing up impacts the habitability of the unit. And there is a duty on the part of the landlord to maintain a habitable unit, and the right or the obligation to pay rent depends upon the unit being habitable. So if a tenant does have sewage backing up into their unit, they can repair and deduct. That's one of the remedies if it's something that can be handled, or they can raise that as an eviction defense independent of this ordinance. The other thing to keep in mind, I just covered it quickly, but in Chapter 2889, we have a tenant displacement ordinance that applies to full-on demolition or change of use. So if the condition of a property were so bad that the whole thing had to be demolished, the tenants would be protected under that ordinance. Okay.
Councilmember Gutierrez. Oh, I'm sorry. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse. Thank you. Sorry.
Confused.
Yes.
So going back to the major point, I think that, number one, the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force should be supported and enhanced to whatever degree we can do that. And that may involve some kind of a fee resolution that has to do with multi-unit owners or whatever. But I think that's because we can parse this ad infinitum and never come to agreement or come up with some law that's so arcane and so negative that it does, as it has in other communities, cause rental houses to even go away or people get out of the business. We're trying to talk about a private sector industry that needs to function on both sides from both people. These aren't public assets. These are private assets we're trying to garner some kind of community control over. If you do, as you say, Mr. Gutierrez, want to move something forward, then we need to move forward with what's been agreed with so far in the task force and to get some redefinition that was proposed. And I think that would be a good first step. All those questions are not going to get answered in one more meeting, though. We're not going to have something in place because it's just too complex, involves too many people, and involves the market. And the market is something that really doesn't like to be controlled artificially. So I think what we need to do is find out what we can do as far as getting the written contracts ratified. We need to be able to get the education piece out. Not to demean staff, but I have not seen this stuff, and I still wonder what the best way to disseminate. I don't know, Ms. Gray, you might have an answer. The best way to disseminate, to distribute information, is it through the task force? Is it through the housing authority? Is it through the property owners themselves? How do we get tenants and property owners that information the best way?
Chair Snedden, Councilmember Rouse. Quickly, just to go over what we've done so far, we held a smaller group. The former landlord task force members who were interested met on April 19th of last year to talk about the educational efforts. Frank Rodriguez participated, Fred Sutton from California Apartment Association, Jerry Morales from the Housing Authority, Laura Bodie from the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association, and Joel Estrada, who is our rental housing program specialist. We came up with several ideas, and I just want to go over quickly what we've done so far. The first thing is we use the city's business licensing list for landlords in the city, and we are regularly sending out little postcards. This is geared towards landlords. And so we've sent one out on the rental mediation program, and we recently, in August, sent one out on information on landlord-tenant rights and responsibilities, which were two of the topics that we were asked to do. On October 13th, the Housing Authority sponsored Santa Barbara Housing Day. That was one of the things we talked about, that Mr. Morales from the Housing Authority agreed to sponsor, and a lot of people were represented there. I think the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association had a booth, Rental Mediation had a booth, Affordable Housing, several other cause had a booth. We paid for this. We, with the Housing Authority, came up with the Affordable Housing Resource Guide, and it includes a lot of different resources. The city actually paid for this directory. We updated the rental mediation website greatly. During the smaller group meeting, we talked about how to get more information. There was talk about putting hot topics on the website. Joel and I met after the meeting, and he actually worked on it. It came up with the Nolo Press books. We have direct links to all of these books: the Landlord Law Book, the Eviction Law Book, and the California Tenant Rights Handbook, the Nolo Press. We received permission from them to put direct links on our website by chapter, which is by topic, which was really useful. We also have scrolls on the city's TV page, as well as Goleta and Carpinteria, because we also serve their clients. And I think that's what we have done so far. I think what was left to do from the list was to have a link to fair housing and best practices with the Santa Barbara Rental Property Association. We haven't gotten to that yet. We talked about Spanish speaking on the website. We went over that it was a long discussion, and we did a lot of research. We found out that the Nolo Press does not have their books in Spanish, so we would have to translate page by page. So instead of that, we have on top of each of the pages on our website to contact Joel if you need help with Spanish speaking. So that's what we've done to date.
Thank you very much. And maybe there's some trigger we can do once we decide what we're going to do about leases and year-long leases, required paper documents, is find some kind of portfolio that automatically gets handed out in English and Spanish.
Yes, we discussed actually having sample leases on
for both landlords and tenants, and once
Yes.
again to get the rental housing mediation task force as a real source of refuge for both sides.
Correct.
So that we don't end up in here talking about arcane laws that are going to go on.
Right. And I do want to say, with the postcards that we sent out, the first one that went out, at least as far as we know, we didn't get a big response. The second one, Joel did receive several calls from landlords, so that was really good to hear.
Thank you very much.
I have a question referring back to the council meeting. So the task force, they were in agreement on some of these items moving forward, but split 3-3 votes for many other items. So these two items before us today, there was unanimous agreement. Is that correct?
Chair Snedden, I believe that is so. If you give me a moment, I can look up the actual votes.
I think it is an important distinction.
The way I read the staff report reporting back the results in January of 2018, the task force didn't internally agree on all the recommendations, but then they voted collectively to recommend the entire package that was supported by less than all of them in places. So it was a package recommendation. There was some internal dissent on the specifics, but they agreed to send it all forward.
And they were recommendations, not an agreement, correct?
Yes, I think that's right.
Okay. And on these two items, because we reference back to the process of the task force very often, and on many of the items, they were 3-3, 3-3, 3-3, and I don't interpret that to be except for the items that we're looking at today. So my question before we do have to close this meeting, my question is moving these two forward, if at a later time we were to look at just cause eviction or not a just cause termination or some other item like that, this moving these forward would not preclude looking at other items in that task force agreement.
No, it would not.
Okay.
Chair Snedden, if I may,
yes, please.
the items that were referred to council, which actually included more than just these two ordinances, were those that were approved by a majority of the task force members. Okay. And it is correct that the package was voted on unanimously by the entire group.
And these two items in particular were voted on by majority and then sent by council here for us to work out the details.
Yes.
Okay. I think, do we want to break these into two separate so that one can move forward, or are we ready to propose a number for the mass eviction so that then council can grapple with it again? You may make your motion now, Mayor Pro Tem Ross.
Well, once again, I think that we need to revisit this because you are talking about trying to make specifics, and Mr. Kalan referred to the slippery slope. I think he's absolutely correct. We could end up in a place where we don't want to go and come up with nothing, or we could move forward with some of these definitions, reconvene the Ordinance Committee and do this.
May I propose that we break it into two separate motions, one for Attachment 1 and one for Attachment 2 for the definitions of mass eviction?
I'm fine with that.
Okay. Is there a motion?
Sorry, what was that again?
Actually, I don't need to direct it. I was thinking if there's still some discrepancy about the number, the threshold number for mass eviction, that we could move forward with the mandatory lease options, possibly direct staff to incorporate these recommendations to both, and then we still need to decide on the threshold number for mass evictions. And I'm not sure, I don't want to rush these decisions, but also want to move this forward.
No, this is like I said, it's a very arcane thing that we're going to affect a lot of people with. So going forward, just to have something is not prudent.
I agree.
So let's bring this. Let's have Mr. Kalan's staff bring this back to us, in with some nuances at the later date that he suggested, perhaps in December.
Will that work for you, Mr. Kalan?
It does, as to the commentary and the letters from the Association of Realtors and the Rental Property Association. But on the metric or the threshold for mass and the financial part of the compensation, if you've got concerns about those numbers, especially we added the extra compensation for the disabled and children and seniors, that wasn't in the recommendation. So threshold for mass and then the supplemental compensation, we definitely need direction on to advance things.
I would like to know how many of our units are 15 units. To me, it's a very arbitrary number. I would like to make it 10 or 8 or 7 or 6. I'm not sure why the 15 is the number that we have, and is that the majority of our mass evictions, or is that sort of a number that's accepted? I'm not sure where that comes from.
Okay, Chair Snedden, that's a very fair comment. If the committee's not prepared, we can bring those kind of data back and at the same time meet with on the details in the letters, and they may have comments on those metrics as well, too.
Very good. I think that would be...
Stipulate to that, right?
Yes. Do we have agreement or want to make a motion to that effect, or is it enough if we have agreement to move that direction forward?
Mr. Kalan, do you need a motion for this, or you just need direction?
Well, no, we would. I do need direction on what you want to do before the next Ordinance Committee opportunity.
All right, then I would move the answers to the categorical questions as posed in the SBOAR materials, as well as definitions, information on the inventory of multifamily unit properties.
And do we also want to include there seemed to be general agreement on forms being made available?
Yes, and how the forms are made available, by whom they're drafted, and how they're disseminated along with the information.
And I liked the idea of a checkbox that a lease was declined so that there's written record of that. Anything you'd like to add to that, Councilmember Gutierrez?
I'd just like to define what mass is.
Yes.
So if mass could be 10% of the units over 30 days.
Would that matter if it was 4 units or 40 units?
It only affects, from my understanding, 15 or more units.
Okay.
Is that correct?
As currently drafted, yeah, you have to have 15, and then, so what you were saying is that more than 10% over 30, if that.
Okay. Does that provide enough direction at this point?
It does, and obviously you can change your minds. It's an easy number to correct. It'll be something we can discuss with the interested groups. And I didn't mean to leave cause or any tenant organization out of the discussion
Of
with
the interested parties?
Yes.
Yes. So they will also be included?
Absolutely.
Thank you. I believe with that we will adjourn this meeting and carry the item forward.